Amen. You could turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 19. Luke 19. And this will be as a Sabbath school lesson, so I invite contributions and answers. Luke chapter 19, and we'll start in verse 37. Verse 37, and when he, Jesus, was come nigh, even now at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees from among the multitude said unto him, Master, rebuke thy disciples. And he answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out. So when we're looking at the line of Christ, where are we in this particular incident? What's occurring? What's the context of this story? It's a triumphal entry. What are the disciples doing? First,
set him up as the king.
Yes. More particularly in verse 37, what are they literally doing?
Praising with a loud voice.
They got a loud voice. A loud voice, a loud cry. And we can call that a midnight cry. So they're crying out. There are other voices. What are the other voices saying? Don't cry. And God says, Jesus says, if they don't cry, who's going to cry? Stones. So what do we understand those stones to be?
Gentiles.
And why do we make them Gentiles?
Because the Jews used to call them stony hearts.
Okay, because they were...
Beyond redemption.
That's the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's go to, if you keep your finger there, go to Matthew chapter 3 verse 7. Matthew 3, 7. Matthew 3, 7, and when he, this is John the Baptist, saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits meet for repentance. And think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father, for I say unto you that God is able of these what? Stones, to raise up children unto Abraham. So what can God do to a stone? So the children of Abraham, they're not stones, are they? They don't come from stones. What do we liken them to? If Gentiles are stones, the children of Abraham were what? So what is it about a stone?
Lifeless.
It's dead. It's as dead as dead. You can't get deader than a stone. So obviously, if you're from Abraham, you're not dead. So what are you? You've got life. And what has life in itself? Okay, I want you to compare a stone with something else. If you be Christ, then you are what?
Seed.
You're seed. So you are either stone. If you're a stone, you're dead as. Or you are seed and you have life within itself. So God says, I don't care. If you're seed or you're stone, I can bring something to life from something that's dead. And so if you go back to Luke chapter 19, Jesus says, if these disciples of mine, these people that I've raised to give a message, don't give the message, then I'm going to raise something that's dead and they're going to give a message. So he's going to use something that's dead. So the stones are still dead. He hasn't turned them into seed. So they haven't got life, but what have they got? They've got a voice. Their voice, because they're going to cry. They're going to give a message. So stones can speak. What else are stones used for? A building, yes, okay. We hew stones. Punishment. Because what do you do with a stone? You stone somebody with them. So they bring punishment. So they've got voices and they're the means for judgment. So they're just some principles that we can draw from stones. So, okay, so, and if you're stoned, what have you been doing? Sinning, and sinning is? Sin is the? So you've been breaking the law. So a stone, it can speak, but it can also speak to condemn somebody who's breaking the law. Okay, so in Bible prophecy, it's a little aside, but in Bible prophecy, can you think of something else that speaks and brings judgment? The end of the world? From the book of Revelation? I'm thinking of Revelation chapter 13. Do you want to turn there? Revelation chapter 13. What does the beast do?
Speaks to the dragon.
It speaks. So if we look at verse 11, Revelation 13:11, and I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So this beast speaks. In the great controversy, what does Sister White say this speaking of this lamb represents?
Government, legislative.
The act of its judicial and legislative power. So what's it speaking according to? Judicial is what? Well, legislative. What? Law and yes, law and judgment. So it speaks. It speaks judicially and legislatively. And if we drop down to verse 15, we see that this beast has power to give life unto the image of the beast. So the image of the beast can do what? Speak. So again, we've got this image that can speak and can cause. So it's going to cause what? Judgment. So here, if we can just keep that thought as we move on, that this image of the beast speaks and causes that as many would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So speaking, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It really depends. It depends on what? On the law. Is it a good law or is it a bad law? So here we've got an example of a speaking and a judgment, a causing, that is based on a bad law. So, so stones speak and stones deliver judgment. The most powerful stone in the world today is who? Would anybody like to guess who the most powerful stone would be?
Satan.
Satan's not a stone, but go on.
Depends what you mean.
Has God raised Trump to give a message?
Well, in that context, it would be the moon. Is that what you
Are we stones?
No.
We're seed. So we're looking for what kind of person?
The most powerful person in the world.
Are you looking for a Jew? You're looking for a Gentile. So we're looking for a Gentile.
Alexander.
A good guess, but I would say there's somebody higher than Alexander.
Oh,
I would say-
Per. The most powerful stone in the world, you need to know how to pronounce her name. Nancy Pelosi. Why am I saying Nancy Pelosi?
She's the leader of the House.
What is she?
Speaker.
She's a speaker. She's not just any speaker.
She is the speaker.
She is in second in succession to the presidency. If something happens to Donald Trump, who takes his place? Vice President Mike Pence. Something happens to Mike Pence, who takes his place? The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. On the evening of September 24, 2019, Pelosi announced that 6 committees of the House of Representatives would undertake a formal impeachment inquiry into President Trump. Pelosi accused Trump of betraying his oath of office, US national security, and the integrity of the country's election. So she was the one that spoke. She announced the impeachment inquiry of Donald Trump on the evening of September 24, 2019. She is the first woman to have served in the office of Speaker of the House of Representatives. As Speaker, as she is second in presidential line of succession. On November 1, so I'll just write that up. So September 24, she spoke. She spoke and she announced an inquiry into what? Impeachment. An investigation. On November 1, she gave an interview. She spoke. And I want to share portions of her interview with you. She said that the impeachment inquiry was important for the American people. They need to understand that nobody is above the law, not the President of the United States. Nobody is above the law. She said, in the earliest days of our revolution, Thomas Paine wrote, "The times have found us," meaning here we are and these are our circumstances. Here they were. They declared independence, they fought a war, they established a country, they wrote a constitution that was to free them from a monarchy and to establish a democracy, a republic. And then she noticed that when on September 17, 1787, it was the day when the Constitution was adopted. When was the Constitution adopted? September 17, 1897, the Constitution was adopted. On that day, when Benjamin Franklin walked out of Independence Hall, they asked him, "What do we have, Mr. Franklin, a monarchy or a republic?" He said, "A republic, if we can keep it." She goes on to say that the genius of that constitution is 3 co-equal branches of government, a check and a balance on each other, a separation of powers, not a monarchy, a republic. That very day, September 17, this year, was the day the news broke about that telephone call, and that went right to the heart of our Constitution. So we'll stop there for a minute. So what has she said? She said that on September 17, 1787, that was the day the Constitution was adopted. Oh, sorry, thank you. 1787. Did I write? I didn't even write 87. 1787 was the day the Constitution was adopted. That the people wanted a monarchy. The people did not want a monarchy. They wanted a republic. But what happened on September 17 this year, she said, went right to the heart of the Constitution. So how do we understand the Constitution of the United States? I'm just going to read from Wikipedia. It says that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the United States. So the Constitution is what? Supreme law. It has 7 articles, and they delineate or describe the frame of government that the United States has. The first 3 articles describe the separation of powers. The first article, does anybody know what the first article of the Constitution is? So what are the 3 branches?
I think it's the House, isn't it?
The House and?
I meant the first article, isn't it?
Yes, so the first article is the House of Representatives. I'll write it up.
Sorry.
The first is the House of Representatives, Congress. Maybe I'll just write Congress, sorry. We'll write Congress. What is it? What's the important checks and balances with Congress, though? What is it that's fundamentally?
They can impeach executive.
It's got 2 parts. It's got a check and balance. So it's got the House of Reps or the House of Assembly, and it's got the Senate. One's appointed, one is voted in. So that's your first article. Your second article is the executive branch. And who's that? Trump, the president. So who's this? Pelosi. We know that it's not her alone any more than Trump is the executive branch alone. And of course the third is?
Judicial.
Yeah, so that's the Supreme Court, judicial. Okay, so and they're the first 3 of 7 articles. I won't go into the rest of the articles. But the first article said there's 2 chambers, the House and the Senate. It is regarded as the oldest written and codified national constitution in force. Since the Constitution came into force in 1789, it has been amended 27 times, including 1 amendment that repealed a previous one, in order to meet the needs of a nation that has profoundly changed since the 18th century. So why does the Constitution get changed or amended? To meet the needs of a changing nation.
Fit for purpose.
The first 10 amendments, what's the name of the first 10 amendments? The Bill of Rights. They offer specific protections of individual liberty and justice and place restrictions on the powers of government. So what do the first 10 do? They ensure the rights of the people, they protect the people's liberty, and it also restricts the government's power. The majority of the 17 later amendments expand individual civil rights protections. So what do those amendments do? They expand the protection. Do they take away the protections? No, they expand them. So everything is there in the original document, but what an amendment does, it expands on the original. It corrects. It clarifies. According to the United States Senate, the Constitution's first 3 words, "We the people," affirm that the government of the United States exists to serve its citizens. Why does the government exist? To serve. So I'm just going to write that word up here. We need to remember this word. It exists to what? To serve. For over 2 centuries, the Constitution has remained in force because its framers wisely separated and balanced governmental powers to safeguard the interests of majority rule and minority rights, of liberty and equality, and the federal and state governments. So the reason why it's hung around so long is because they wisely framed it to balance government. They separated the powers, and that has ensured that you have majority rule and minority rights. So I'm going to go back to Nancy Pelosi now. Any questions on the Constitution? Good. That'll do. So let's go back to Nancy, Speaker Pelosi. She said, in one conversation, he, Donald Trump, undermined our national security by withholding military assistance that had been voted on by the Congress of the US to the benefit of the Russians. So there had been military assistance that had been voted on by who? Article 1, by Congress. They had voted, they had put it into law that this is what we're going to do. We're going to give the Ukraine military assistance so that we protect them and to protect us from who? The Russians. But he undermined national security by saying he would withhold it. At the same time, he jeopardised the integrity of our elections, the heart of our democracy. And in doing so, in my view, he possibly violated his oath of office to protect, defend and conserve the Constitution of the US. So he takes an oath that he's going to defend the Constitution. And what is he doing? Undermining it. She went on to say, she talked about the genius of the Constitution, about its three separate co-equal branches of government, the legislative, the executive, etc. But what she said is that what Donald Trump is saying about this second article is that Trump is saying that he can do what he wants. I can do what I want, I'm executive. He's not realising that he is actually second article, not first article. So he says, I can do what I want. She said that if he only read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, they did not want a monarchy. They did not want a unitary government where one person called all the shots, overturned an action of Congress, overturned military assistance to a country. She said, this is all about the Constitution. We are defending our democracy. In that interview, she made it very, very clear when it comes to impeachment that this is not about his character, his morality, his behaviour, even about his policies. What this impeachment is about the Constitution. She says it's all, and she just repeated that over and over again. It was about the Constitution and whether he abused his power to advance his own personal interests by undermining the Constitution. So what was he doing? Using his power as the executive power to advance his own personal interests. Why is he there? To serve. And what's he going to do? Serve himself. He's not serving his country. He abused his power to advance his own personal interests. And that's what undermines the Constitution. And the Constitution is what? The supreme law. She went on to say, they were asking her about the impeachment, and because everything's about the impeachment, and it's like it sucked the oxygen out of whatever else is happening. And she said the House of Representatives has sent scores of bills to the Senate, but all the oxygen is being sucked up by the impeachment inquiry. And she listed a few. So they've sent scores. How much is a score? 20. So she said we've sent scores of bills to the Senate. The opposition, not the opposition, the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, has said that I'm the Grim Reaper. What's the Grim Reaper do? Yeah, kill. So every time a bill goes to the Senate, what's he there to do? To kill it. What kind of bills have they sent to the Senate? She lists them. Gun violence protection. Climate action now for the young people. We want climate action right now. For women, she said, ending violence against women. Equal pay for equal work, raising the minimum wage where 2/3 of people getting a raise will be women because they're not getting equal pay. She said protecting the dreamers. Who are the dreamers? They're the young immigrants give them a chance, let them have an education, to have, have a certain visa and then have the opportunity to maybe to get full citizenship. We need to protect the dreamers. Immigration. So she listed all these things: gun violence, climate action, equal rights for women and violence, and then the immigration. And the Equality Act, which would end discrimination against LGBTQ community. She said just a few of the bills that the House has sent to the Senate. So all this time this impeachment's going on, what is the Senate doing? Shutting down the expansion of the Constitution. And then she made this profound statement, and I want to write it on the board. She said, "Thank God that they," and by they she meant the founding fathers, made it, and it, she means the Constitution. Thank God that the founding fathers made the Constitution what? Amendable. Why is it made amendable? So that it could expand freedom over time. What did the founding fathers do? They said this Constitution can be amended. What does it mean to amend something? We're going to correct it, but we're going to correct it by expanding it. And what is the idea of expanding the Constitution? To expand freedom over time. So this it's showing that they recognise the progressiveness of the Constitution, that while it's set in stone to a certain degree, it can be expanded on, so that the issues related to freedom can be clarified and enlarged and made clear, which is clarified. And when a president takes an oath to take his office, he takes that oath so that he can strengthen the Constitution which he serves. So the reason there's amendments is so that there can be more freedom, and this takes time. Were they always free?
Depends.
When did they get freedom? So if we can picture ourselves as John the Revelator, in Revelation 13, where are we standing? We're on the beach. We're on the beach. And if we look one way, what are we going to see? The sea. And what's in that sea? A dirty, great big beast with teeth that can chew you up and feet that can tread you down. And who's doing that to the people that live in the old world? That beast has what? Horns with crowns. So it's kingly powers over there in the old world that are going to tread you down, that will take away your freedom. As he looks over into the earth, what does he see? A lamb-like beast, which has two horns. Are there crowns on it? No. And they represent what? The separation of powers. So he's on the beach. So there's this transformation between a kingly power and freedom. No freedom in the old world. They had to move to the new world. When they got to the new world, did they have freedom?
Not really.
No, why didn't they have freedom?
Changed to the old.
They're still changed, they're still connected to the old. And the old was who? One of those crowns. One of those horns had a crown. That's the English government. And they were still chained to that horn. And over time, those restrictions in the New World got too much, and so what did they decide to do? revolution. They had to break away. They had to fight a war of independence to get independent of that horn with the crown on it. And then it could announce that it was independent or free. So in order to guarantee liberty, to ensure and protect freedom, it needs a government that works within a framework of law. So now it's free, what does it need to have to make sure it stays free? It still has to have law. So I want to go back. We've looked at the Constitution. They've had their War of Independence, or they're in their War of Independence. They're rejecting the kingly authority of the old world. They're going to announce that they're free. They're going to break those chains. So what do they declare? They make the Declaration of Independence. They say we're free. They make a declaration. The Declaration of Independence was the solemn declaration of the Congress of the United States of America on 1776. What date? You all know it. 4th of July. We even know that, don't we? 4th of July 1766, by which they formally renounced their subjection to the government of Great Britain. So now they're free. The Declaration of Independence officially broke all political ties between the American colonies and Great Britain. It set forth the ideas and principles behind a just and fair government, and the Constitution outlined how this government would function. So the Declaration of Independence says we're free. The Constitution says this is how what it's going to look like to be free. What does it look like to be free? It looks like to have laws. Can you have freedom without law? No, you've still got to have laws, because what are those laws going to do? Protect that freedom. And when they don't, if they fall short of protecting that freedom, what are you going to do? You're going to amend them over time. They're going to expand. So I want to now talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. I'm just going to read the first paragraph. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, that's all they had back then, was 13 states. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, so when it becomes necessary that we break our ties with England, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them. And so now we can create our own government, like everybody else around the world can. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So what we now owe everybody is an explanation of why we're separated. So when the time comes that you've got to separate from a kingly power and we can create our own government, then we need to be able to explain to you why. And that's when it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's going to announce truths. What are these truths? Truths are what? Self-evident. What does it mean when something's self-evident? No explanation, no proof. What needs no proof, according to the Declaration of Independence?
We're all equal.
All men are equal. And because they're equal, they are endowed with unalienable rights. What does it mean when a right is unalienable? Can't be taken away.
Or given away.
No, you can't give it away. Nobody can take it away. It's innate. It belongs to you. So unalienable rights. And these unalienable rights, among these are what?
Life.
I'll write unalienable rights, which equals life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So, I have the right to live, I have a right to be free, and I have a right to pursue happiness, whatever that happiness looks like. We'll talk about that more in a minute. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So what do you need to be able to have life, liberty and pursuit of happiness? You have to have government. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So any type of government? Is a monarchy a government? Yeah, it is. But does the monarch have the consent of the governed? No, they don't have that consent. Then whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organising its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So if a government's not doing this for us, what do we have the right to do? Get rid of that government, bring in another government that's going to ensure that all men are equal, that their inalienable rights are protected. So
That's what we think we do every time we have an election, isn't it?
So who wrote this Declaration of Independence? The first draft was written by Thomas Jefferson, and then it went to a committee of 5 who, in his words, butchered it, or mangled it was his words, but they fixed it up, and then it went to the second Congress. So it went through a process to formulate this document. When Jefferson submitted his original draft, those opening paragraphs that I just read, they didn't change them. I think maybe inalienable was changed to unalienable, something like that. But largely they left those opening paragraphs alone. So that was the introduction. What followed after that was 20 reasons why they left Britain. And they got stuck into the king. They got stuck into the British people for allowing the Parliament to do what it did. And then the last part of that was just announcing that we're free. So they made some small changes to improve its clarity and accuracy, but mostly actually Jefferson, those 20 articles, that was reduced from a lot. They took 25% out of Jefferson's list, but they've left 20 in there. So Thomas Jefferson, he wrote those famous words. Where did he get them from? So what I want to do is take us back in history, because this Declaration of Independence, other than the list against Britain, it was largely plagiarised. And it was plagiarised from the works of a man called John Locke. And who was John Locke? We're going to go back in history. If you were to ask Thomas Jefferson who the 3 greatest men were in history, he was asked that once, he listed 3. He said Francis Bacon, he said Isaac Newton, and he said John Locke. The men that wrote this constitution, formed the government, the founding fathers, were largely influenced by certain philosophers from the Enlightenment period. One was John Locke. Another was Baron de Montesquieu. So who influenced the writing of this Declaration of Independence? An Englishman and a Frenchman. it was Baron de Montesquieu that came up in the 1500s with the idea that government would be best served if there were 3 co-equal branches. So that wasn't new to the United States. He said, if we separated the powers, if we separated the judiciary from the executive, from the legislative, then we will be able to preserve rights. So they had read those, and they've gleaned all these principles from writers before. What John Locke did was all those opening paragraphs was pretty much a plagiarism of a book that he wrote in 1689. And it's called The Two Treaties of Government. And so I just want to take us back to that history, just to get a little overview of what was going on in that time. So a little bit of English history. You all got what kind of a Bible? King James. King James was James the First. James the First lived from 1603 to 1625. He was the grand nephew of Henry VIII. So he was a Protestant, but he was also a strong monarchist. So we'll see that come out in his son, Charles I. Charles I was 1625 to 1649. And he was a Catholic. And Charles I believed in the divine right of kings. He believed in absolute monarchism. He gave no concession to Parliament. He ruled with an iron fist. And so what did Parliament do to Charles I? They chucked him out and they beheaded him. He was executed. So who took his place? No. We don't know our English history very well. Ever heard of Oliver Cromwell? Yeah. Not a king. He ruled from 1653 to 1658. And how did he rule? He was a Puritan. And he enforced his Puritan beliefs. So dancing halls were shut down. Music, any place playing music was shut down. What else did he do? No, banned Christmas. He was a dictator. Oliver Cromwell died, and his son took his place, but not for long. His son was very weak. Parliament took over, and they reinstated a king. And they brought back Charles II. Charles II ruled from 1660 to 1685. He was known as the Merry Monarch because he brought back all the music and the dancing halls. He did a lot of bad things, but he was a happy monarch. And he was the one, he actually passed what's called the Test Act. And the Test Act was banning Catholics from Parliament. After Charles, so we've got James, Charles, dictator. Now we've got Charles, and who do you think comes next? James II. And James II went from 1685 to 1688. And James II was a Catholic, and he believed in absolute monarchism. He believed in the divine right of kings. And it's during this time, because of these two made a lot of mistakes. They wasted money on wars. They wouldn't support the Parliament. It's actually during this time period here that Britain became a Commonwealth. So what they did is, what happened was what's called the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was a bloodless revolution that brought down this king. Nobody died. What they did was, James had a daughter called Mary. Mary was a Protestant, and Mary had married William of Orange. And they said to William, come over and be our king. And so so they ousted James II, and they put in William III, he's known as, or William of Orange, because he was Dutch, and Mary II. What do we have? We had a joint monarchy. They ruled together until Mary died. Then William ruled alone until he died. It's during this time period here that the works of John Locke, of Montesquieu and others are being used. Because what you've got is you've got a split in the British people. There's those that want representation. They don't mind having a monarch, they don't mind having a head of government as long as he listens to the voice of the people through the parliament. And you've got others. The other group are known as patriarchals, but they believe to a political belief called patriarchalism. Patriarchalism. And basically patriarchalism is the divine right of kings. There was a man called Robert Filmer. Robert Filmer died in 1650, but he had written a book called The Divine Right of Kings, where he traced King, because what they wanted to do was reinstate James II. He hadn't died. They wanted to bring him back, put him on the throne. So you've got this split. And what Robert Filmer did was he traced, supposedly, James right back to Adam and said the very first king was Adam. The very first king was a man, who was a patriarch, and then he traced, he gave all these reasons why God instituted a monarchy through Adam, and then it followed through all the millennium, and that's why we should have James II reinstated. When William III and Mary II were co-ruling, most of their time was spent fighting these monarchists, and that was largely the Jacobins. So they didn't have a fun time of it. So this glorious revolution, it overthrew the Catholic king, replaced William of Orange and Mary. So John Locke, he's written this book, Two Treatises of Government, and what he did was he took Filmer's book and he just pulled it to pieces. Because what they were using, what Filmer was using, was biblical, what they thought were biblical proofs. And so Locke went into that and just showed how, I mean, some of it was just silly. Actually, if you go down to Genesis 1, I'll show you what they did. If you go to Genesis chapter, Genesis 1. Verse 26. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, etc. So what he would do is he would replace the pronouns, and he would say the them is Adam. So all John Locke had to go in and say, well, them has to be Adam and Eve. And they both had what? Dominion. They ruled co-jointly. And then he would go to Genesis chapter 3 and the curse on Eve and show that seed man was put over woman. She was subject. So, and of course John Locke just refuted that and said, yeah, that's that. So God's made Adam king in one day and a day labourer in the same breath, because he got cursed as well. So it's just argument after argument that gets refuted. But what's interesting is that in this book that John Locke wrote, he wrote these words: there is truth that is self-evident, that all men are equal and they have unalienable rights of life, liberty, but he didn't write pursuit of happiness. He wrote property. the acquisition and the possession of property. And all that Jefferson did was he changed that into the pursuit of happiness. But essentially they're the same thing. Now, when John Locke wrote of this property, he meant it in a narrow and a broad way. So in a narrow way, he meant, yeah, you can own land, you can own stuff. But in a broad way, it means you can have aspirations, education. You know, you're free to pursue your happiness wherever that takes you, as long as you respect life and liberty, not just for yourself, but also for others. You can't have life and liberty for yourself and then not expect that on other people. So we allow the pursuit of happiness. So we could sum that up with the right to buy or sell. To see if I've got that quote him. In 1689, Locke argued in his 2 treatises of government that political society existed for the sake of protecting property, which he defined as a person's life, liberty and estate. In a letter concerning toleration, he wrote that the magistrate's power was limited to preserving persons' civil interest, which he described as life, liberty, health and indolency of body and the possession of outward things. He said that the highest perfection of intellectual nature lies in a careful and constant pursuit of true and solid happiness. Whereas the patriarchal system, it defended the concept of absolute power for the monarchy. The book that this filmer wrote was called Patriarcha, where he used genealogy to legitimise kingship. We'll leave that there. So property, it's a wide range of human interests. It's not just things that you possess. It can be material goods, but it can also be aspirations. So let's back up. So you've got men that have moved to the New World. They are not free, but they overthrow the government that is keeping them in servitude, and they become free, and they declare themselves free through that declaration. Now they have to preserve that freedom. How are they going to preserve it? Through the Constitution. So what's the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? The Declaration of Independence, this is called natural law. Natural law is self-evident. It needs no proof. Natural law consists of fundamental principles of justice and right. The fundamental characteristics is that people have equal dignity before God, and the government is erected primarily to protect people's rights. Now, what's the difference between this natural law and the Constitution? The Constitution is called positive law. So the idea of government, positive law is man-made. It aspires to the ideal of natural law, so that's the ideal, but it doesn't always meet. Positive law doesn't always match up with natural law. But the purpose of government is to bring them as close together as possible. And that's why the Constitution is amendable. It expands freedom over time because they want to bring this positive law as close to the ideal. So when this was written, these truths are self-evident. These truths are self-evident. When was that written? Were all men equal? No. So what's the problem with that statement? If you're living in 1776, why isn't that put into practice in 1776?
You need a government to enforce it.
What are you going to enforce? They're actually placing in government. So 1776 they write this. By was it 1789 they've got their constitution. 1791 they've got their Bill of Rights. In 1791 are all men equal?
No, slavery.
In 1798? No, they're not equal. So what's the problem? It's this. What constitutes a man? Who are men? Because if you're men, you're equal. If you're not man, what are you? You're property. So am I a man?
No, your property.
Oh, yeah, I am. Yes. Yeah, but back then I wasn't a man. So you become property. Was a heathen a man? No. So then they became property. Therefore they have no right, not in control of their life or their liberty, and they cannot pursue happiness. So what has to happen to the law over time so that all men could have freedom? We have to have amendments. Those amendments are just clarifying. Who wrote this? We say Thomas Jefferson, he didn't, he plagiarised, he admitted it. Even James Madison said we weren't meaning to come up with nothing new. We just wanted to, use what's out there. I'm paraphrasing. And they did. That wasn't their intention. They just were using the thoughts of the age, of the time. Did Thomas Jefferson like slavery?
No.
But did he have slaves?
Yes.
Yes. So it becomes a problem back then.
So it comes down to the people in charge interpreting what that means at that time.
And looking at the time and thinking, because he had slavery, how I said there were, in the Declaration of Independence, he writes 20 things against Britain. He wrote more than that. They took 25% out of what he wrote. He was not a happy man. One of those was slavery. He was charging Britain with slavery and all that. They took that out. Their concern was they needed 9 states to ratify that document. And if they didn't get it ratified, it wasn't going to go through. So expediency was, let's leave that out. We don't want civil war now. Let's just get this through. So makes you wonder what would have happened if they had actually took that stand and said, no slaves. They thought that they would be in a mess, and that was probably what would have happened.
So they literally read that. That was a literal reading of how they interpreted.
They understood that all men were equal, but they couldn't implement it. So it was as it was. And then they eventually did get civil war. So rightly or wrongly. Sometimes out of expediency, people write things that need to be amended in due course.
Knowing that it's not 100%.
Yes.
Of course, if they put people, women would have had a say, wouldn't they? And that would have been terrible.
I think they were... Go on.
I think when they say all men, it's like including, it's not just gender, they're including women as well.
When it was originally written by John Locke?
No,
Yeah.
when written by,
Yes, but
because they understood that we are referring to men, women, blacks, Asians, but they decided not to press the issue on slavery and all that. But they know what they meant.
yes, and I mean, you've got the Carolinas, you had southern states that they needed to help ratify this document. John Locke certainly believed all men. He was very much and wrote against slavery and was for women's rights back in 1689. This was the age of enlightenment. This,
Coming out of the Dark Ages.
yeah, these were philosophers that were bringing light to the world. We kind of, we roll our eyes with philosophy, but there was a lot of truths that were being expounded.
So they could have used the word people.
What did God use the word? What word did God use? In the beginning, God created man.
So that's why they used
But the word
Male and female created He.
yeah,
them.
The word in the Hebrew is more general
Yes.
than that.
Yeah, we lose it in the English.
it.
Not sure whether you could place John Locke as a stone because there's no loud cry there, but would he be considered a stone?
No, okay, so my purpose in going back to him is saying that these thoughts aren't new,
No.
that they generated from the old world, that the new world were well-read, educated people, chose the ideas that they knew were needed to start fresh. We know what monarchy looks like. We don't want that here. So we're going to have to go back to these writings, to these men, and these are the words that are fueling their desire for freedom. Point is, what kind of freedom is it? Is it unrestricted freedom? What's restricting them? Laws, the Constitution. So the Constitution is there to protect, to put this in practice and to protect it. The founders believed that in a perfect world, positive law would be the same as natural law. In an imperfect world, that's impossible. But they tried to make positive law approximate natural law as close as possible. Oh, whoops. So this Declaration of Independence, it served several purposes. It stated a natural law. The natural law is we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's a natural law. You can't argue against it, needs no proofs, needs no explanation. Second, it showed how British legal practice varied from this idea. So, like I said, he lists 20 reasons why they've got to separate. Because the British practice wasn't all men are equal. Why aren't all men are equal? Because who was king? We've got to skip quite a few years, but it was King George II. During this period of independence. And then thirdly, it explained that the variation between what they wanted and what the British government were forcing on them was so great that they had to separate. After independence, the Declaration remained as a statement of America's natural law ideals. So that's, the Declaration of Independence is a statement of what they would ideally like America to be like. And that is, we're all equal, we all have a right to live, we all have a right to be free, we all have a right to pursue happiness or to buy and sell property or to get a wedding cake. You know, we have that right. The Constitution does this in at least two principal ways, by rules and procedures that are designed to produce better results. So what does that mean? What the Constitution is there for is to not only provide the parameters to keep that possible, but also to improve it. The founders could not produce a constitution that approximated natural law in every way. For example, most founders recognised that slavery was against natural law, but given the constraints of the time, tolerating slavery was the better of two bad choices. If the Constitution had banned slavery, it would not have met the 9-state threshold necessary for ratification. We talked about that. It would have been a fragmented country. It would have led to civil war that would have lasted a lot longer than the one they had. So the way to conform the Constitution more closely to natural law is not to pretend it means what it does not mean. The way to conform the Constitution more closely to natural law is to duly amend it. What is it saying? Is that we don't bend the Constitution, we amend the Constitution. We don't try and read into the Constitution what we think they're trying to say. What we do is we amend it and make it say what it's meant to say. So what have we learnt so far? At the time of the midnight cry, or the loud cry, God raises up what? Stones. These stones give a message, and they are a means of delivering judgment. And we looked at one example of a stone, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. She announced the formal investigation into the impeachment of the President of the United States. The reason for the impeachment inquiry, what was he doing? Misusing his power for personal gain, which undermined the Constitution. He was violating his oath of office, or it's got to be proven, but he's kind of proved it himself. So why did we say government was in... what is the purpose of government? To serve. And what did he do? He served himself. And again, this is the problem when you go back to all these kings. What were they doing? Serving themselves. And particularly if you go look into these, the excesses that they had, the taxes that they wanted raised for their own personal benefit, is the reason for this glorious revolution. Kingly power. We looked at the Constitution and we've compared it to the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is what kind of law? Natural law. Constitution is positive law. So it's natural that all men are created equal and are endowed with inalienable rights. But the Constitution gives the framework for the laws that will ensure that freedom and equality. So, and it's amendable, it expands freedom over time. So in expanding the Constitution, what we want to recognise is that everything is there in the Constitution, it just needs to be expanded or clarified and put those thoughts into law so that there is no doubt. So are there any questions so far? So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, what we've been doing is we've been looking at the external. When we come back, we want to look at the internal, and we'll see how this relates to us as God's people. So I'd like to close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, that you have created all men equal and that you are the Creator God. We thank you for the messages that bring us life and liberty, freedom. Lord, you are our pursuit of happiness. We give you everything that we are and everything that we have. And we want, Lord, to understand what it means to be your people at the end of the world. As we look at the world that is in crisis, we pray that we would learn the lessons, that we can govern ourselves according to your will. So be with us now until we return. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.